Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us to discuss the news that had started coming out last week that a new nuclear deal with Iran might be in the offing or might already be in process. We're not entirely sure. But to try to parse what we know and discuss the implications of it, I'm delighted to have the JINSA Iran Brain Trust here know more about the nuclear issue and the nuclear negotiations with Iran than anyone else, including John Hanna, the Randy and Charles Wax Senior Fellow here at JINSA, Steve Rademacher, Senior Counselor to JINSA and member of our Iran Policy Project, and Gabe Noronha, also a fellow at JINSA, all of whom have been tracking this issue closely. I'm Blaise Mishtal, the Vice President for Policy at JINSA. I'm delighted to have all of you with us. We'll try to dig in a little bit into what we know about this deal, what it's going to look like, when we might see more about it, and what the reactions to it have been thus far. And then happy to open it up to questions from the audience. If you do have a question, you can use the Q&A feature on Zoom to type out your question, and then I'll read them out and address them to our panelists later on in the program. So with that, let's get started. Steve, maybe I could turn to you first to try to give us a sense of how we got to where we are. President Biden came into office promising a longer and stronger deal. But then last we heard, about 6 months ago, he said that the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, was dead. And now all of a sudden last week, there's this news of a new deal. So how did we get here? What have been the steps along the way?
Well, Blaise, I think that's an excellent question. You are correct. President Biden was elected on a platform that he was going to bring back the JCPOA. I think during the campaign, he suggested that would be a relatively easy thing to do. But once taking office, I think he and his advisors realized that they couldn't just do this with a snap of the fingers, that they would need to negotiate with Iran on returning to the deal, because Iran was substantially out of compliance, and they would look foolish if they brought the U.S. back into compliance without having ensured that Iran was also back into compliance. So starting more than 2 years ago, the Biden administration commenced a negotiation with Iran. The negotiation involved the other parties to the JCPOA as well. And this was taking place in Geneva. As is fairly typical of a negotiation with Iran, there were a number of points during the negotiations when the parties appeared close to reaching a deal. But Iran has a very typical negotiating pattern. Just when all the other parties think a deal is within reach, the Iranians come racing in with just one more demand that they had neglected to mention up until that point, and then suddenly the negotiations have to start over again. And they've done that repeatedly over the last 2 years. Last September, it looked like they were very close to a deal. I think most observers thought a deal was about to be reached, but once again, Iran came in with additional demands about basically they wanted the rest of the world to call off the IAEA and make sure they didn't have to explain some inconsistencies that the IAEA had found in the information Iran was revealing. So that all fell apart. And then there were two other developments that really seemed to sidetrack the negotiations. There was the protests in Iran, and then the human rights violations perpetrated by the Iranian government against the protesters. That, combined with Iran's decision to become basically the arsenal of autocracy in being one of the, really, along with North Korea, just about the only country providing weapons to Russia in support of its war in Ukraine. And that combination of the human rights violations and becoming a supporter of Russia in Ukraine, I think soured the Biden administration on further efforts to restore the JCPOA. And for the longest time, it appeared that basically we were going nowhere. But meanwhile, Iran was making more and more progress with its nuclear program, which is what I guess led to this rather unexpected development that now, instead of just bringing back the JCPOA or doing what they originally said they wanted to do, which was to negotiate a longer and stronger deal, They're now talking about a shorter, weaker, well, at least a weaker deal, far weaker than the JCPOA. And I guess it further appears that they intend to do it in a way that would make sure that they don't have to submit this agreement to Congress for review, notwithstanding that U.S. law is pretty clear that any agreement, no matter what its form, with Iran relating to the nuclear program is required to be submitted to Congress.
Thanks, Steve. So, Gabe, maybe we can dig into a little bit what we might know about this deal. But first, let me just flag. I was looking at the State Department briefings from last week after news of this potential deal started emerging in the press, and we have the State Department spokesperson when asked whether there's a deal on the agenda. He says, "I would say that rumors about a nuclear deal, interim or otherwise, are false and misleading." So I guess, is there a deal? Isn't there a deal? What do we know?
Well, it's interesting. The spokesperson is saying that the actual State Department and other U.S. government employees are telling me personally that that's not the case, that there is actually negotiations and deals happening. And it looks something like the following, that there will be first an attempt to have a hostage deal, which would involve the release of 3 U.S. hostages who have been held in Iran for mostly around close to 7 years for 2 of them, and about 3 or 4 years for one more, Ahmad Sharji. In exchange, the United States would likely release some Iranian prisoners held in U.S. prisons, but then also provide Iran with about $7 billion worth of frozen Iranian funds, which are currently being held in South Korean banks. Now, the administration is going to claim that this will be used only for humanitarian purposes, and they'd be held in an offshore account. But in reality, anything that the Iranians can use to spend on humanitarian goods is just more money they have freed up to increase their regular government spending on, say, terror programs, military and repression forces, and, say, weapons to Russia and Ukraine for their war against Ukraine. That appears to be sort of the opening salvo that would enable the new, what the administration is calling an understanding about Iran's nuclear program. And from what we're hearing, Iran would suspend its enrichment at 60% purity of uranium, by which it would not accumulate any further uranium from the about 114 kilograms it currently has. Now, they could still actually continue to enrich at 60%. They just would have to downblend it to about 20% or lower. But the key issue here is that there would be no further restrictions on Iran enriching at the 3.67%, the 5% level, or the 20% level. So they would be able to continually build their stockpile of lower and medium enriched uranium, which is sort of the feedstock that you use to ultimately get to that 60% and 90% weapons grade uranium. In exchange, the United States would be granting Iran significant sanctions relief, particularly for Iran's oil sales. One thing that Iran has been frustrated by is tankers in the Gulf and elsewhere, which are transporting Iranian oil, have been sort of approaching the United States and saying, we don't want to be sanctions violators, so here, take our oil so that we don't penalize us. Iran wants a stop to all of that, and they want a stop to all further sanctions on Iran's economic program. And it appears the United States is willing to give that up. But there's also a huge amount we don't know about this deal. We don't know what other sanctions concessions might be given. We don't know what, if any, reductions to Iran's nuclear infrastructure might be given. Right now, it appears there are no restrictions there. And we don't know if there's about 17 billion more in frozen funds which might be released. The Iranians have been claiming that about 10 billion frozen in Iranian and Iraqi banks would be released shortly. And they've been claiming recently that about 7 billion currently in funds at the IMF would soon become accessible to them. Now, it's important to note they've been claiming these things for about 1.5 years as being imminent. But now that there's actual talks which appear to be proceeding, there's reason to believe that one of the US concessions might be sort of a slow injection of cash into the Iranian system as long as they sort of suspend their enrichment at the current levels.
So a couple quick questions on that, Gabe. Do we know anything about how these talks are happening? Are they happening in sort of the same process as we saw with the JCPOA, where it's the US and the other five, the Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians all getting together in Vienna, or how's this happening?
So one of the consequences of Russia's war against Ukraine is that it has made the United States and European countries really reticent to include Russia in the talks. And that has all sort of degraded the JCPOA-like discussions that we're having previously in Vienna. So the United States is now talking sort of semi-directly to the Iranians in Oman through what are being called proximity talks. So recently, Brett McGurk has been traveling to Oman. He's in one hotel, the Iranians are in another hotel, and the Omanis are sort of ferrying messages between them. We've also seen that Rob Malley, the special envoy to Iran, has been meeting directly with the UN ambassador to Iran, likely in New York, possibly here in DC as well. So they've sort of cut out some of the other interlocutors and partners and are dealing a little bit more directly. The hostage talks are also being facilitated in large part by the Swiss government. The Swiss government is the United States protecting power in Iran. They deal with consular issues for the United States. And back in 2018 to 2020, during the Trump administration, the Swiss were also sort of the main interlocutors for the United States for the two prisoner swaps that the Trump administration conducted.
So we've seen sort of in the interlude between when the JCPOA talk sort of fell apart and now people raising ideas of maybe an interim deal, sort of a time-limited deal might be a way to sort of get the process started. Is that idea now being instantiated in this deal? Do we know? Is it a time-limited deal? Does it have some sort of duration?
You know, those are some of the questions that Congress should be asking and ideally would be receiving from the administration. Right now, that's unclear. The best I've heard is the description of the talks as being goodwill gestures for goodwill gestures, and that they are sustained as long as it is convenient for both sides. So the United States could give several concessions to Iran. Iran suspends its enrichment for a month, and then Iran decides that it wants more out of the United States. It needs bigger concessions, and it will just continue to increase its nuclear program. The really troubling thing about these talks, from what we've heard so far, is that there's no mechanism to enforce Iranian compliance with its commitments.
And then sort of last question on this, Gabe, what do we know about the structure and the process of the deal itself? Sort of in the past, when we had JCPOA, we had a big long document that was released. There was, some sort of signing ceremony. The details, at least public details, were open to everyone to read. Do we think that's going to be the case with this deal? Are all these questions and unknowns that you've raised going to be answered at some point?
So one thing that I've heard consistently within both the administration and some of its top supporters for these Iranian negotiations is the concern that anything that they can do goes in front of Congress. There's the concern, basically, if the American public sees what's in these deals, that there's going to be so much objection that it's politically toxic and can't pass Congress. And so what the administration has devised is, instead of calling the deal a deal, they're either calling it a mutual understanding, a memorandum of understanding, or simply that way the administration is saying right now, we are telling Iran what's in its interest, and Iran is telling us what's in our interests. And they magically come to an agreement where they start supporting each other's interests all of a sudden. That's all an attempt to really bypass the submission of any deal to Congress. And they may even keep this entirely off paper. That way there is no documents for Congress to sort of take in review. Again, it has nothing to do with the actual ideal mechanics of a deal. It's all about circumventing Congress's role of oversight and the ability for them to vote on it. That was enshrined in the 2015 Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act that was passed with nearly unanimous bipartisan support by both chambers of Congress.
Thanks, Gabe. I'll want to come back to this issue of congressional review a little later. But John, let me turn to you and sort of ask, why now? Why are we getting an agreement now? Why are we getting it in this shape? Particularly on the Iranian side, if, as Steve said, the Iranians love to sort of say, one more thing and add another condition for any sort of deal, to the extent that it seemed like they weren't really all that interested in getting back to JCPOA, or at least didn't seem particularly perturbed that those negotiations fell through. Why would they be interested in coming back to the negotiating table and signing on for this shorter, more limited deal or set of mutual understandings?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a good question on both sides, on both the U.S. and Iranian side. What's in the deal for both, assuming that this deal happens? What's the incentive and motivation for both sides? As Steve said, once it became clear that the JCPOA was not going to be revived last fall, and particularly in light of the Iranian repression of its own people and its, as Steve said, becoming the arsenal of Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine, it really became politically almost impossible in the United States to get a majority of the U.S. Congress in favor of a deal with Iran. In that context, I think the administration last fall was of the opinion that, well, if we're not able to get a deal, if that's impossible, maybe the ideal situation for us heading into the 2024 elections is no deal and no crisis. But in order to have no crisis, of course, they needed two parties to cooperate. They needed, of course, the Iranians to agree that they weren't going to continue advancing their program. And they needed an Israeli government that wasn't legitimately increasingly alarmed by what was happening with the Iranian program, and has clearly been dedicating a lot of resources, time, and energy to thinking about the unthinkable, which would be a unilateral Israeli strike on the Iranian nuclear program. That the chances of that happening, I think, increased over the course of the fall. The Iranian program continued to advance, and so the notion of the administration just sitting on its hands no longer seemed viable. They therefore, sometime last December, began to get this ball rolling of a new negotiation on some kind of interim arrangement. And so here we are. I think it really is all about, unfortunately, I hate to be so cynical about 2024 for the president and the administration. The worst possible outcome for them would be to have to do something significant militarily to devote resources and time and energy to a crisis in the Middle East over the Iranian nuclear program. That's their highest priority of what they want to avoid. And they have latched on to this idea of an understanding with Iran as a way to do that, one that allows them, as Gabe has said, to circumvent, they think, the United States Congress entirely and their obligations under the law, under INARA. They think it at least gives them some prospect for at least a short period of time, maybe the next 18 months, to not have the Iranians do something to cross a red line that would force some kind of American or Israeli action. And I think they think once they have a deal with Iran, even if it's only a gentleman's agreement and understanding, it makes it much harder for Israel to exercise any kind of unilateral strike against Iran once the United States is in some kind of arrangement, not to have the Iranians further escalate their program. For the Iranian side, Gabe and Steve may be better on this. I think, the Iranians, this will now de facto legitimate through U.S. payments of billions and billions of dollars and an agreement not to pursue further sanctions, not to enforce the sanctions that are on the books, to allow Iran, which has now already, I think, reached record levels of exports under the Biden administration from where it was under the Trump administration. I think as much as 1.5 million barrels a day now that they're able to export, that they now know that they can increase that and it will be untouched by the American government. All the while, they keep all of their existing nuclear infrastructure. They continue to be able to work on whatever secret and quiet programs they have on weaponization. They can continue to work on developing R&D on their very advanced centrifuges. And in the meantime, earn billions of dollars because they have been in a period, at least up until earlier this year, of potential real crisis in the Iranian political system, given the amount of discontent and protest and violence and instability that was happening internally within Iran. They could use a breather as well. And if it doesn't require them to roll back any of their existing achievements and accomplishments in violation of the JCPOA, in fact, legitimates it to a certain extent, if they're allowed to continue enriching at 60%, so long as they blend it down, if they can continue to enrich at 20% and accumulate stockpiles of 20%, which is highly enriched uranium, which is 90% of the way there to weapons grade uranium, then it as a temporary deal that has significant economic benefits and doesn't require a lot of them in terms of rolling back their nuclear program. I could see that it may make some sense for the Iranians to go along with this as well, particularly as Gabe says, if there's no enforcement, no real mechanism for the United States, if the Iranians were to breach elements of this deal, to come after the Iranians.
Thanks, John. Steve, curious on your thoughts maybe on what the Iranian motivations here might be. But also let me ask you, if we cast our minds back to 2013, 2014, ancient history, but the way that we got to the JCPOA originally was that there was an interim deal, the joint plan of action, not yet comprehensive, would sort of bought some time for negotiators to get to the JCPOA. At the time, the issue was Iran's stockpile of 20% enriched uranium and the fear that they were going to accumulate a bomb's worth of that. Is this sort of a similar interim type deal that you think is meant to sort of buy time and build goodwill to get to a bigger deal, to get back to JCPOA or something else? Or is this, as John said, just sort of a stopgap measure to kick the can down the road?
Well, unfortunately, Blaise, I think it's much more of a stopgap measure. I've seen no suggestion that this understanding, or whatever it's going to be called, is intended as a stepping stone to some longer, stronger deal. To the contrary, it seems to me to be precisely what John described, which is an effort to patch something together that will postpone any crisis over the Iranian nuclear program until after the next presidential election. I'd put it in the same category as what we see going on with China right now. Secretary Blinken over there trying to get past some of the friction in the bilateral relationship. I think the conclusion I draw is that the Biden administration is already in re-election mode, and that they've decided they only want there to be one foreign policy crisis going into the next election, and that's the one that they're stuck with in Ukraine with Russia. They want to put all the other ones on the back burner, and I think that's fundamentally what this deal is about. In addition, though, to the presidential election, I think there's another event that's on the administration's mind, and that is that on October 18th of this year, the UN embargo on missile transfers to and from Iran will expire. It expires automatically under the terms of the JCPOA. And we all know that Iran has been supplying drones to Russia to support the Russian war effort against Ukraine. What they've not been providing is ballistic missiles, but Iran has ballistic missiles, and after October 18, will be under no legal prohibition on transferring them. Iran claims, well, first of all, they deny they provided any drones, but they also insist that any drones they've provided are not within the parameters of the UN prohibition. But the ballistic missiles that they've not transferred so far clearly would be within the parameters that are prohibited. So after October 18th, that restriction is going to go away. From the administration's point of view, that very much, unfortunately, coincides with the time at which they're going to need additional U.S. funding for the war in Ukraine. The current funding is going to run out over the summer or early fall. And I think the administration recognizes it's going to be hard put to explain why it's decided to allow the UN prohibition to expire and for Iran to be able to legally step up its military assistance to Russia, while at the same time asking Congress to appropriate more money to help Ukraine defend itself against Russian aggression. And we know that there are a number of Republicans in Congress that are skeptical about providing funding to begin with. For them to be able to point to the decision of the administration to allow Iran to increase its military assistance to Russia at the same time they're asking Congress to appropriate more money to combat the Russian aggression will be very awkward. So I think they very much want to put this deal together. I think they very much want some element of it to speak somehow to Iranian support to Russia. Whether they will achieve that or not, I don't think we know. But that would very much help them get past the funding problem they're going to face on Ukraine later this year. But to go back to your original question of, why would Iran want to do this? I mean, the fundamental answer to that is this is a very good deal for Iran. This is a very good deal. People say, well, weapons grade uranium is 90%, and they won't be able to go above 60%. So that's a lot of protection against Iran being able to produce a nuclear weapon. Well, the physics of uranium enrichment are that at 60%, you are very, very close to having 90% enriched uranium. But I guess I should also point out, you don't need 90% enriched uranium to produce a nuclear weapon. The nuclear weapon we dropped on Hiroshima was only enriched to an average of 80%. So 90%, that's for a really good weapon. 80% is a good enough weapon. They're going to be limited to 60%, but within a week they could enrich 60% uranium to 90% and have enough enriched uranium to produce a nuclear weapon. So for Iran, this is a restriction, but it's not a very meaningful restriction. If they decide to break out, they are very close to being able to do so. And what do they get in exchange for this very, very limited restriction on their enrichment activities? They get at least $7 billion in cash, maybe 17 billion. I mean, Gabe, I've heard that maybe the Iraqi money is going to be provided to them as well. So that would be a total of $17 billion in cash to help them fund, first to help address the economic problems they're facing, but also fund their military and proliferation activities. And if there's additional sanctions relief on top of it, which there certainly will be, because you can imagine the arguments within the administration when they spot sanctions violations. At every turn, the question will be, well, if we do something about this, if we impose sanctions, isn't that going to upset the Iranians? Isn't that going to give them a justification to walk away from the deal? Isn't that going to embarrass us with the looming presidential election? And from the Iranian point of view, so what? What if they do disregard whatever the terms are of this understanding? I mean, show me their signature. Show me the document that commits them to not do whatever the administration is going to accuse them of failing to do. Apparently, in its zeal to avoid having to submit any agreement to Congress for review and having to be embarrassed in Congress trying to defend it, there will be no written document. So, I mean, anybody who thinks the Iranians are not going to take advantage of a situation like that to push the envelope hasn't been dealing with the Iranians for very long. So to me, it's kind of a breathtaking leap of faith. And I guess I'd go even further. To me, it's an act of desperation on the part of the administration to contemplate a deal like this. And no written undertaking on the part of the Iranians, no yardstick to which you can hold. I mean, they'll say we got some understanding, they would do something, and then if the Iranians do it, the Iranians just say we never committed to that. Show us where we committed to that. You know, you're making this up.
Thanks, Steve. So, John, let me ask you about something that Steve brought up, which is the reporting that this deal actually includes not just agreements for Iran to restrict some very small portion of its nuclear activities, but actually to rein in some of its malign activities, including, as Steve said, potentially in the future selling ballistic missiles to Russia, but also ceasing its attacks on U.S. forces in the Middle East, of which there have been, more than 80 in the last 2.5 years. Given that one of the criticisms of the JCPOA was that it did nothing to address anything beyond the nuclear program, that it didn't get to the regional aggression that Iran sponsors and enables. Is this a positive step that the deal is going to be broader than just the nuclear file?
Well, I mean, you're right, because I mean, in addition to what Gabe has talked about, there has been this discussion that, okay, the Iranians will not sell, in fact, supply the Russians with ballistic missiles, even though this purported deal doesn't seem to say anything about the continued provision of lethal drones to Russia. It also does allegedly say something about the Iranians discontinuing their attacks on American forces in places like Syria and Iraq. And I think there's also something in there perhaps about some form of increased cooperation with the IAEA in terms of inspections and verification obligations, or the comprehensive safeguards that they have to clear up questions with the IAEA about their past nuclear activities. I get, you can put a positive spin on those, but it goes along with the sort of the hostage question. If you're being extorted because you're fearful that the Iranians will engage in harmful activities and malign activities against the United States, and your response is to pay them billions of dollars to get them to stop, it strikes me it's never a good thing for a nation to engage in that kind of behavior. If you have other options, particularly if you're the superpower and the largest power in that region up against a really distressed middle power, like the Iranians are who actually have a lot of vulnerabilities. And the United States, of course, has options. Rather than paying the Iranians, allowing them to extort us, not to do bad things against us, the United States has overwhelming military and economic power to exert enormous deterrent pressure on Iran to get it to stop its attacks and its proxy attacks against our forces. In the Middle East, we have enormous levers to enforce our sanctions against the Iranians, as the Trump administration did, to really cut off their economic lifelines. And we have the option of developing a very credible military deterrent to tell them that if they were to ever think about crossing the 90% threshold or moving to a nuclear weapon, that the United States has all the elements in place and the political will to destroy the Iranian nuclear program and do damage to that regime that it will come to regret. So those are all options available to the administration to muster the overwhelming hard power the United States has to confront Iran. But that is clearly all of those things I've just mentioned as alternatives to the policy of paying off this theocratic, radical, revolutionary regime that is the number one state sponsor of terror, is on the threshold of building nuclear weapons and is attacking American forces on a regular basis in the Middle East, not to mention our best allies rather than paying them off. There are other ways that a superpower actually deters and contains and constrains a middle power like the Iranians. And the administration has kind of disarmed itself from all of those alternative policy courses, that kind of plan B strategy, because it's determined that the absolute worst thing could be the chance and the risk of it having to take that kind of significant action in the Middle East that could result in some kind of military conflict that would interfere with all the rest of their plans, both domestically and in foreign affairs. And so I think it's very regretful. I think we will, while we might get a temporary respite from this deal, I do believe in the long run we will come to rue it, because I think we are setting in place, solidifying Iranian violations that have put them on the threshold of a nuclear weapon. And at the time and place of their choosing, they, now will have a capability to cross that threshold very, very quickly, and at a point in time when the cost to the United States and its other allies in the region of trying to do something about it are going to be even higher than they are today.
On this issue of hostage taking, Gabe, as you mentioned, the previous two administrations also traded with Iran for hostages. How does this deal compare to sort of what previous administrations have done? And then any additional thoughts you have on the sort of the trade-offs, the costs and benefits of the deal as we know about it?
So in January 2016, the Biden administration handed $400 million in cash in euros, francs, Swiss francs, and other currencies in what is now known as pallets of cash to Iran, and then transferred an additional $1.3 billion through European intermediaries to Iran. At the same time, on the exact same date, Iran transferred 5 hostages to the United States on Iranian jets, and they met in the middle in Europe. So that was roughly $300 million, a little over that per hostage. What we then saw over the next couple of years was Iranian generals and top Iranian officials saying things like in public, we can balance our budget if we just take enough American hostages. If we take 100 American hostages, they're worth $300 million apiece, and that balances our budget. And so we saw this enormous incentivization within the Iranian regime, not just to take Iranian hostages, but those of dual American citizenship and lots of other Europeans. They've used those over the last 5 years to enormous benefit. They've gotten many of their top terror operatives out of prisons across the world, and they've gotten large numbers of frozen funds released by European and other Asian partners of ours. In the Trump administration, we set a very clear policy, both internally and to the Iranians, that we would not pay a single cent to the Iranians now or ever for the hostages. And one of the things that did was it kind of lowered the value of American hostages to the Iranians. We complained about them incessantly. We raised their cases to the public and the press every day. And the Iranians started viewing them almost as a liability rather than an asset. And so we did 2 one-for-one prisoner exchanges through the Swiss government as intermediaries, where we released fairly low-level Iranian prisoners and got back Xiue Wang and Michael White from Iranian prison. So 2 hostages out for 2 prisoners, $0. What we're now seeing is, again, the idea of giving effectively $7 billion for 3 American hostages. So that would be $2.3 billion per hostage. That's about 8 to 9 times higher than the price was paid in the Obama administration. Again, if you look at the internal rhetoric and planning from Iranian officials, they view that as an incredible cash bonanza and a way to balance their budget. For reference, the IRGC's annual budget is about $3 to $3.5–4 billion a year. So they can do all their terror operations twice fold just for the amount of money that would be given in this hostage deal. It's a massive amount of money for the Iranian government. And I think without any getting either for all the various dozens of European hostages out for that sum, and a mechanism to ensure that Americans aren't taken hostage further, what you would see is that American tourists and travelers around the world would suddenly become the most prized possession of any foreign government. If you are a newfound terror group and you're trying to think of ideas of how to get more money, you look at the Iranian example and you say, this is Americans, unwitting Americans are the most valuable asset we can take as an organization. And so it's not about how much it costs our government to do this thing. The issue is how much this endangers American citizens around the world if we start paying billions of dollars for American hostages. And that's why a lot of hostage families, especially those who have gone through the ordeal, they look at this deal and they say, don't ever take this. This is going to lead to dozens of more families going through the same ordeal that our family.
So Steve and Gabe, I wanted to circle back to a topic that you both have touched on, which is the issue of congressional review. And you mentioned the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act. So I wanted to ask you to dig a little more into that and sort of lay out how that deal or how that law might apply to any future deals, including this one. And let me combine that with a question that we actually already had submitted from Gary Seymour, which is to you, Steve. Do you have evidence that the Biden administration is seeking to evade review under INARA with this new deal?
Thanks, Gary. So I have no evidence of anything on any of this. So what I have is random press reports, many of which are being denied by the Biden administration. We're speculating in virtually everything we say here. But the Iran nuclear agreement is fairly clear in its language. When you read, it provides that any nuclear agreement with Iran must be submitted to Congress for review within 5 days of conclusion of the agreement, and then there's a procedure for Congress to review and potentially vote on whether to approve or disapprove the agreement. That law contains a definition of what is a nuclear agreement with Iran. And, I don't think the authors could have written it more broadly. I mean, it was crystal clear that they wanted any nuclear deal with Iran, whatever of any kind, to be submitted to Congress for review. And I'll just read the definition in the law. The term agreement means an agreement related to the nuclear program of Iran that includes the United States, permits the United States to take action, or pursuant to which the United States commits or otherwise agrees to take action, regardless of the form it takes. Okay, so regardless, it doesn't have to be a written agreement. It doesn't have to be, signed as a treaty. Regardless of the form it takes, if the United States has reached an agreement, or the term understanding is synonymous with agreement. I mean, I think it's hard to, say that the term agreement doesn't encompass an understanding. That commits the United States to take action, which apparently they're undertaking to do here, and it relates to the nuclear program of Iran. It triggers that definition by my reading. Now, I've worked in this area for decades, and when I've worked as a lawyer in the executive branch, I've worked as a lawyer in the Congress, and I know how the game is played. You could get some administration lawyers to say, well, we think what's come up here, it's really not an agreement, it is just an understanding, and it's not in writing, and there's nothing to submit. And they could cook up some arguments about why they don't think they trigger the INARA requirement to submit the agreement to Congress. Certainly that kind of interpretation is inconsistent with the spirit of INARA. I would argue it's also inconsistent with the letter of INARA. But in the real world, what are Congress's remedies if the administration just chooses to disregard the spirit, if not also the letter of the law on something like this? They can file a lawsuit. That will go nowhere. It will take drag on for months and months and months. If the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee is really upset, and Senator Menendez may be about this, he can put administration nominees on hold, refuse to confirm State Department officials. That's a way to try and force the administration to do something. Congress can try and pass a law doing something bad to the administration. You've got a Republican House of Representatives, they conceivably could pass a law like that. Much less likely that the Senate is going to pass legislation that seriously forces the president to submit the agreement. That would be quite a confrontation, and the Democrats are in charge of the Senate. They're probably not looking at a food fight among Democrats over this issue. So the administration may feel that it has the political latitude here to disregard the law. The press reporting that I've seen suggests that's precisely what they intend to do. But Gary, no, I don't have any proof that I can give you that that's their intention. But it's interesting. Gary Seymour would ask that question. He's negotiated with the North Koreans and I think also the Iranians. Would you ever want an agreement with the North Koreans that wasn't in writing? An understanding with them about under which we were making concessions and getting commitments from them in exchange, but it wasn't in writing. This is an extraordinary way to proceed in this area. And what possible reason is there for doing it? Well, either the Iranians are prepared to commit in writing to do anything, which would be deeply troubling if that's true, or the administration doesn't want it in writing because they don't want to have to submit it to Congress for review. Those are the only two explanations I can come up with.
Gabe,
I do have some proof, which is that U.S. government officials have told me that this is all intended to circumvent NARA. Again, it's their word, but I tend to trust them based on all the evidence we're seeing. The other really interesting piece of evidence here is Rob Malley, the U.S. envoy, went to a roundtable at J Street a few months ago with kind of folks you would expect to be there, including Trita Parsi and others. Tess Bridgman, who was the special assistant to President Obama for legal affairs and ran both the legal and detainee files at the NSC in 2015 and 2016, argued, and I found the video of this, basically that they should circumvent NARA and use a process of gesture for gesture, goodwill action for goodwill action, and specifically cited because if Congress sees this deal and is submitted to this deal, it will become next to impossible, and it won't be able to do anything. And so she and the whole group of pro sort of Iran deal advocates agreed that this was the best recourse to do something, and explicitly mentioned that this was designed to circumvent NARA. So, that's my best indication that yes, there is sort of a thought out strategy here. In terms of recourse, again, it's difficult unless Congress is willing to do something on a bipartisan, bicameral basis to actually do something. Otherwise, what we'll see is just a fait accompli, that they will break NARA, they will do it and sort of say, okay, what are you guys going to do about it? One option that exists is sort of the lawsuit. And interestingly, there is some Supreme Court precedent for members of Congress to sue the executive branch if they've been suffered an institutional injury, namely that they've been deprived a right of a vote, which they are guaranteed under NARA. However, this would all be pretty new breaking ground on the legal side. And as Steve mentioned, it would probably take months and not likely go somewhere. But it's an interesting avenue that a enterprising member of Congress might pursue.
In the meantime, the Iranians will have gotten their money.
Yes, and yes, exactly. So that's difficult. There are other avenues that congressional leadership can take to sort of force back the snapback of certain sanctions on Iran. That would be required at the level of Minority Leader McConnell or Speaker McCarthy to sort of snap back the sanctions. That is under review, I think, by congressional leadership, but unlikely to happen right now.
So on the topic of Inara, let me just add Gary Seymour's two-finger response, which is my experience with the North Koreans is that they cheat, even if the agreement is in writing. Potentially same experience with the Iranians.
Why tempt them by having an unwritten agreement, right?
John, let me turn to you and wanted to ask you a bit about any response that we've heard from our regional partners in reaction to the news that this deal, not a deal understanding might be in the offing. And let me sort of use that as an opportunity to work in a question from Michael Schwartz, who asks, how do you explain Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's flip-flopping on this new deal? First, he said that Israel will be able to handle it, but now he says that the agreement is unacceptable.
Oh, you're asking me to explain Israeli internal politics at this time. That's really almost an impossibility. Listen, I've been confused. There was a lot of reporting about a prime minister, a closed door meeting he had in the Knesset at which he, yes, allegedly said, something along the lines of, we don't like this very limited deal, but somehow Israel could live with it. And then last week, toward the end of last week, he had to come out with a public statement to try and clarify and say that, no, that's in fact not the case, that stopping the Iranian nuclear weapon has been my highest priority all along, that his entire career has demonstrated that he believes whether it's the larger JCPOA or any kind of limited deal only paves Iran's pathway to a nuclear weapon by legitimizing the program over time. So I'll take him at his word that they're opposed to this. There has been some activity on the Hill that groups like AIPAC have supported, assuming with the knowledge of the Israeli government, to try and, I think most recently, get 26 U.S. senators on a bipartisan basis, raise some concerns about the Biden administration's approach to Iran, and that they'd like a much more of a hard power approach to deter the Iranian nuclear program. But within, I also read today that Israel's got its own politics, and that the opposition leader Yair Lapid is attacking the prime minister today for allowing this limited deal to occur. That when he was in office, he was able to stop any kind of deals between Iran and the United States, and therefore this is a major failure for Prime Minister Netanyahu if this deal goes forward. So there's a lot of internal politics in Israel as well. I can tell you that whatever may be the feeling within the Israeli cabinet about these kinds of arrangements that the United States is making, it still seems to me to be the case from the anecdotal evidence I have that within the Israeli security establishment, they are still of at least two minds of this. You may have some people who are dead set against any kind of American-Iranian deal, even a limited one, but there seem to be still plenty of people within the Israeli Defense Forces and maybe within other parts of the Israeli security establishment who are prepared to hold their nose and let this kind of deal go ahead, because they know within their own abilities and planning and preparations for any kind of military strike against Iran, that they still need some more time. That time to them is very precious. The additional months they might buy in terms of getting ready for an attack on Iran, that as bad as this limited deal may be, if it gives them that kind of time to be more effective in a strike, to acquire more capabilities, then it could be worth it from their perspective. So my sense is there's no one united Israeli view of this, and the prime minister is navigating all these things. The one other thing I should mention is that there has been press reporting, I have no idea if it's true, that clearly the prime minister is angling for a visit to Washington. He'd like to come and have his time in the Oval Office 6 months into his term. It's very uncomfortable for an Israeli prime minister not to have that kind of invitation. I think it's completely counterproductive from the American point of view, or has become counterproductive to the extent it does show this growing distance between the United States and Israel on even a critical question like the Iranian nuclear program. The other issue that the prime minister is interested in that might constrain his willingness to really frontally take on the Biden administration over Iran is his other key foreign policy priority, which is to get a normalization deal with Saudi Arabia. And for that, he really does need the president of the United States to suck it up, to reset, stabilize America's relations with Saudi Arabia, and to expend some real political capital with his own party to actually reset U.S.-Saudi relations in a way that would move the Saudis to normalize relations with Israel. And I know the prime minister wants and believes that President Biden has to play that kind of role. So are any of those factors constraining him as well from really putting it all on the line with regard to this limited arrangement or understanding? It's possible, and but at this point, it's all speculation.
John, one last question for you, and then I'll ask all of our panelists for their final thoughts because we're about to run out of time. But concisely, John, how does this potential deal play into this shifting tide that we've seen in the region of sort of everyone talking to everyone, or everyone making nice suddenly, with the Saudis and the Iranians having this Chinese brokered sort of rapprochement of Assad being back in the Arab League, of everyone making nice with Qatar all of a sudden. How does this deal play into that dynamic, as opposed to the sort of the push for Saudi-Israeli normalization and expansion of the Abraham Accords?
I think it certainly confirms the Gulf states, and the Saudis in particular, that they're on the right path, that their calculation and conclusion that the last thing the United States wants to do is step up and use its hard power in a sustained way in the Middle East to achieve real political objectives, including deterring and containing, constraining Iran's malign activities in the region, first and foremost his nuclear program. That's not a factor right now in the Middle East anymore. The United States can't be counted on, and therefore Saudi Arabia will continue to talk to everybody, play all sides, make whatever deals it needs to make in the absence of real hard American deterrent power to continue to exist and thrive and grow in that region.
Thanks, John. Gabe, any concluding thoughts?
I think there's one thing of, yes, this deal is bad and should be opposed. I think there's another, and that's the policy question, which should concern Congress. The other one, which really concerns me, is the sort of breach and contempt for Congress and the lack of separation of powers being enforced. In a classified briefing, after a classified briefing to Congress last month, multiple senators came out and sort of said, yeah, there's nothing happening, there's no deal. Even SFRC Chairman Menendez said there's nothing happening. The fact that there was, in fact, lots of things happening behind the scenes, and that they would, effectively mislead and perhaps even lie to Congress is deeply disturbing. The idea that they would then circumvent a law that was passed with the explicit purpose of Congress saying we want to have a view and a voice on this issue, which was signed by President Obama, is really deeply disturbing to me, and it should concern everyone else, that the executive branch feels that their deal is so tenuous and hard to defend, they simply won't defend it to Congress at all. I think that tells you everything you need to know about the contents of the deal. If they had a good deal that they could defend, they would probably go and tell Congress about it and submit it to through an R. The past administration pledged that any deal it reached with Iran, it would submit as a treaty to the Senate. And I think that's sort of the standard we ought to look at for any deal with Iran, is something that both sides of Congress and the American public can at least get behind.
Thanks, Gabe. Steve, any concluding remarks?
Well, maybe I'll just echo what Gabe said, but put an exclamation point after it. ANARA was an acceptable law to the Obama administration, because it was very clear to them that at the end of the day, the NARA review process would permit them to go forward with the JCPOA. Because in effect, the way the review mechanism works is that ultimately, unless 2/3 majorities of both chambers are in opposition to the agreement, the president can veto any legislation that would stop the agreement, and he can go forward with his policy. And that's pretty much how things worked out on the JCPOA, because when a majority of when they held the vote in the Senate, when they held the vote in the House, in both cases, a majority of the chamber voted no on the JCPOA. All the Republicans of both chambers voted no, and a substantial number of Democrats also voted no, including people like Chuck Schumer and Bob Menendez. But it wasn't a 2/3 majority in opposition, so they got their deal. That's still what NARA provides. So the fact that they've now come up with a new deal that would be poorly received in Congress. I mean, the JCPOA was poorly received in Congress. They could submit this to Congress, comply with the law. Presumably, there would be votes in one or both chambers with majorities voting no. It must be that they're actually fearful that there would be a 2/3 supermajority in both chambers to vote no. That would be the only reason not to repeat here what they did, or what the Obama administration did on the JCPOA. I suppose the other explanation would just be that they'll be so embarrassed by the debate that they just want to avoid that embarrassment. But it's not like NARA would prevent them from doing this. They could, in all likelihood, go through the NARA process, comply with the law, and still implement this agreement.
Thanks, Steve. John, 30 seconds to close us out.
Yeah, I'm done, Blaze. They've said it all. I agree and entirely with Steve and Gabe.
All right. In that case, thanks to our panelists for providing their insights today. Thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us. As always, stay tuned to JINSA for the latest developments of if and when this deal happens. You can find our latest analysis on jinsa.org, and look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks.